Behind bars, corrupt cops are confronted with a justice system that is much harsher than that of the courts. These men, once protected by their uniforms, thought they could escape the consequences of their treachery. But in prison, it's not the law that catches up with them, but the vengeance of those they swore to control. We look at 4 cases of police officers who met a tragic fate in prison. Theodore Dyer. On October 29, 2014, Theodore Dyer, a former Muskegon County Airport police officer convicted of pedophilia, was brutally strangled by his cellmate at Michigan's Saginaw Correctional Facility. This violent act underscores the deadly risks within prison walls and the severe contempt inmates hold for child molesters. Theodore Dyer was convicted in 2013 for sexually assaulting a 9-year-old girl. The assault occurred when the girl's mother, Mary, discovered Dyer in the act after she instinctively walked into his apartment. Her daughter later revealed that this was not the first incident. Dyer received a sentence of 25 to 50 years in prison, a fate that would ultimately be cut short by his cellmate's actions. Dyer was placed in a cell with Stephen Sanderson, already serving a life sentence for a murder committed in 1991. Sanderson, having been convicted for killing his girlfriend, was no stranger to violence. According to Sanderson, Dyer's incessant discussions about his child molestation case drove him to the breaking point. Sanderson claimed he could not tolerate Dyer's recounting of his crimes and decided to take matters into his own hands. Thus, on October 29, 2014, Sanderson confronted Dyer in their shared cell. The confrontation turned deadly as Sanderson hit Dyer and then strangled him with a cord. Sanderson later confessed to the murder, stating that he did it because Dyer was a child molester and wouldn't stop talking about his case. Flores de Olivera. Up next is a police officer who, convicted of a string of murders, walks free after serving his sentence. But just weeks later, he's gunned down in a hail of bullets. This isn't a scene from a movie. It's the reality of Flores de Olivera, a former Brazilian cop who became a notorious vigilante killer, only to meet a violent end himself. Flores de Olivera, also known as Cabo Bruno, in the 1980s, terrorized the outskirts of São Paulo. As a police officer, he became disillusioned with the justice system and decided to take the law into his own hands. Under the guise of cleaning up the streets of São Paulo, he formed a death squad that targeted and killed criminals, or those he perceived as such. His reign of terror saw him accused of over 50 murders, often carried out with extreme prejudice. Victims were sometimes selected merely based on their appearance or minor tattoos, which Olivera saw as indicators of criminality. Despite the severity of his crimes, Flores managed to evade capture for a time, earning a fearsome reputation. His downfall came when a surviving victim identified him, leading to his arrest in 1983. Flores was subsequently convicted and sentenced to 113 years in prison. Bruno managed to even escape prison multiple times before his final recapture in 1991. During his time behind bars, he claimed to have found religion, becoming an evangelical pastor and even getting married while incarcerated. But here's the twist. After serving only 27 years, a controversial parole decision set de Olivera free. News of his release sparked outrage, with many fearing the past would repeat itself. So, just over a month after leaving prison, de Olivera found himself the target. While returning from a religious service with his family, he was ambushed by 2 gunmen who riddled him with bullets. De Olivera's relatives were unharmed, but the ex-cop wasn't so lucky. The motives behind de Olivera's murder? Some speculate it was revenge by criminals he'd targeted during his vigilante days. Others believe it may have been linked to gang violence or even a personal vendetta. Gerard John Schaeffer. Gerard John Schaeffer wasn't your average cop. He was a rising star as a sheriff's deputy in Martin County, Florida. Clean-cut and charismatic, Schaeffer seemed to embody the best of law enforcement. But beneath the badge and uniform, a monstrous secret festered. Just a year into his career, Schaeffer's twisted desires led him down a dark path. A path that would ultimately end, not on the streets, but brutally cut short within the very prison walls he should have patrolled instead. You see, Schaeffer's criminal behavior began early in life. By his teenage years, he had developed sadomasochistic fantasies and a penchant for bondage. His dark fantasies escalated over time, leading to his eventual crimes. Schaeffer's behavior continued into his adult years, even as he pursued a career in law enforcement. He briefly worked as a teacher before being dismissed for inappropriate conduct and eventually joined the Wilton Manors Police Department. His tenure as a police officer was marred by misconduct, including using his position to harass female motorists. In 1972, however, he became infamous famous as one of the most gruesome serial killers in the state's history. And while not every minute detail was published due to the nature of his crimes, investigators believe that by this point in time, he may have been responsible for the deaths of dozens of young women across Florida. His preferred method? Luring hitchhikers, binding them with wire, and subjecting them to horrific torture before taking their lives. The facade began to crumble in September when two teenage girls, Nancy Trotter and Paula Wells, barely managed to escape Schaeffer's clutches. Under the guise of protecting them from the dangers of hitchhiking, he drove them to a remote area, bound them, and threatened to kill them. Fortunately, Schaeffer was called away by an urgent police radio message, allowing the girls to escape and report him. This incident led to his arrest and a 6-month jail sentence for assault. While Schaeffer was serving his sentence, the bodies of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup, two teenagers last seen alive weeks prior, were discovered. Evidence in Schaeffer's writings linked him to their murders. He was subsequently convicted and sentenced to life in prison in 1973. Throughout his imprisonment, Schaeffer maintained his innocence, claiming he was framed by his attorney and prosecutors. Stripped of his badge and authority, Schaeffer, however, found himself on the other side of the bars. The story doesn't end with his incarceration, though. Despite being locked away, the demons that haunted Schaeffer remained. In December 1995, while serving his sentence at Florida State Prison, Schaeffer was found murdered in his cell. The motive for the attack? Reportedly, a petty argument with another inmate over a cup of hot water escalating into a deadly confrontation. The irony of Schaeffer's demise is undeniable, though. The man who preyed on the vulnerable, who used his position of power to inflict unimaginable pain, found himself the victim of a similar act within the supposed safety of prison walls. Sergeant Stephen Floyd. Last but not least is Sergeant Stephen Floyd, who was found lifeless at the James T. Vaughn Correctional Center on February 2, 2017, after a harrowing standoff. Sergeant Stephen Floyd, a veteran of the Delaware Department of Correction for 16 years, met his untimely death during a violent inmate uprising, which had begun only a day earlier, February 1, 2017. The inmates at the facility took Floyd and 3 other staff members hostage. The culprits' grievances included complaints about oppressive conditions and lack of educational opportunities, exacerbated by political tensions and fears of changes under the new administration. For nearly 20 hours, the situation inside the prison was volatile, with inmates armed with makeshift weapons, creating barricades and threatening the lives of the hostages. Floyd's final act, however, was one of heroism. You see, despite being overpowered and stuffed into a closet, he continued to call out to officers coming to his aid, warning them that inmates had set a trap. His warnings allowed responding officers to avoid the ambush and ultimately saved their lives. The intervention came finally when authorities used a backhoe to smash through a barricade of footlockers. Floyd was sadly found unresponsive. He had been brutally beaten and stabbed, a victim of the inmates' violent revolt. His death was ruled a homicide caused by blunt force trauma and stab wounds. A second hostage, a female counselor, however, was safely rescued minutes after the tactical teams forced their way into the building at the all-male 2,500 prisoner facility. Floyd's death was a significant event, not just because it was the first on-duty death of a correctional officer in Delaware's history, but also because it highlighted critical failures within the prison system. Union officials pointed to chronic understaffing and inadequate safety measures as contributing factors to the uprising and Floyd's death. Known for his dedication, Stephen Floyd earned the rank of sergeant within his first 2 years and was awarded for outstanding performance multiple times throughout his career. He was a family man, deeply committed to his wife, children, and grandchildren. His colleagues remembered him as someone who consistently went above and beyond, working overtime to support his family and always standing up for what was right. His actions, even on that fateful day during the uprising, saved lives and exemplified the highest standards of duty and courage. In the aftermath of his death, there was an outpouring of support and recognition. Vigils were held, and his body was escorted in a solemn motorcade from the prison to the medical examiner's office, reflecting the deep respect and mourning felt by the community and his fellow officers. Delaware Governor John Carney and other officials acknowledged the profound risks correctional officers face daily and called for thorough investigations to prevent such tragedies in the future. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.